Welcome to week 3 of our resistance protest read. We're going to be chatting one woman protests today and talking about how freedom for some women doesn't necessarily extend to all women. Now, this week I've invited the incredible Denise Headley to lead the conversation. You probably already know her from the Headley Highlights show or from LBC. But what I love about Denise is that she doesn't just talk about politics, she's lived it. She was a local councillor for Enfield between 2001 and 2014, and she spent the last 2 years making politics accessible across multiple platforms. And in case you're new here, I'm Abby. I'm writing a PhD on protest and policymaking under authoritarianism. At least I'm attempting to write a PhD on this. And I'm using this protest read as an excuse for us to learn more about our country's history of protest. Spoiler alert, sometimes we win. There are 2 questions that we're trying to answer in these protest read chats. So the first is, how did this protest succeed? For example, from my perspective, did it change policy? Did it overthrow government? Did it win compensation? Did it change social attitudes? And so on. And the second question is, what are we still struggling to achieve in terms of the aftermath of this protest? So you've got things like strikes and industrial protests, like the Merthyr Uprising, that by the time this goes out, I will have talked about the week before, so this week. Okay. And these risings won us the right to unionize. But then you've got more than 100 years later, our current government trying to remove those rights. So how have we gone forwards, but also how have we gone backwards? And obviously, the protest that we're talking about today is a little bit different. We're talking about the fight for mothers' custody rights, otherwise known as the fight for children's right to have a mother, because framing it as a women's equality issue wasn't really an option. But as you said on WhatsApp, we're also talking about a fight for some mothers and some children. So I thought, before we dive really deep into the story itself, do you want to add a little bit of context to who Caroline Norton was?
What I thought was important was to actually investigate the person after I'd read the story. And it turns out that Caroline Norton basically comes from slave money, and she was landed. She was part of the gentry. She was also part of high society. And one of the reasons she was successful is because of her networking and who she knew. It wasn't necessarily Caroline's character. She was slightly unconventional and candid, and that brought her enemies as well as friends. But that was the seedbed within which she met her husband, because there was a whole family of them and they were noted for their beauty, which I thought was also interesting, because it then placed those women in a particular archetype of existence, because I'm also doing some stuff on Meghan's archetypes. I thought I'd just fling that in there. Okay, so what you see, in my opinion, is the structures of colonialism. And the reason that Caroline Norton became an important person was because of her alleged affair and who she was having an affair with at the time. So you've got to understand the political context. She was in liaisons with the current Home Secretary at the time. I think his name was Melbourne. And that was the basis of the divorce case, which brought her to prominence. The fact that she was later treated poorly by the same structures that she benefited from, and she never said nil point about, okay, I think is particularly interesting. Even though she did, there were important things, because it seems like her work was the seedbed for some of the later women's movements that came about, looking for votes and particular types of emancipation for women, which also didn't include women of color or people of color. So it's always about, who patriarchy rewards in a way. It rewards white women because they are an implicit and important part of it, but not too much.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like, there's something that always hits me when certain men, like the of the world, talk about how they want to take us back to the good old days, and his love of the Victorian era just gives me chills, because not only for the vast majority of people, sure, but it hits me how much most of us would lose from this. Like, we're talking about, sure, good old days where wealthy, white, well-connected women were sort of starting to access the reins of power and achieve modest reforms for themselves. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of painfully familiar as a story, especially when we're talking about protests, because it goes back to this sort of uncomfortable, difficult issue of sitting at the intersection of several sort of sometimes conflicting identities. That I talked about this last week with Elio. I don't know if you watched the YouTube of that, but you've got, as you just said, Caroline Norton being this privileged woman with wealth and comfort that came at the direct, horrific expense of colonial subjects and enslaved Africans across the empire. But then she was also a woman and subject to oppression herself. And so you feel this kind of gravity of like, shit, what would we lose if Caroline Norton hadn't protested, or if politicians like decided to take us back to Victorian England? You know, that hit me hard in this story. But also I loved that the story sort of brought in modern struggles that parents and mothers across the world and that children across the world are still sort of suffering at the hands of liberal democratic regimes like ours. And it's a lack of rights that sort of feeds into this same dynamic of those in the UK living this privileged, comfortable life where British mothers don't have to fight for access to our children. But at the same time, there are women on British soil subjected to these same power structures that you just described, these colonial power structures of privilege and intersecting access that you and I benefit from in different degrees, of course. But on British soil, there are mothers facing this same impossible sort of gut-wrenching reality at the hands of our immigration system. You know, we think of it as this American issue, but on British soil, this is happening. Parents are being separated from their children. They're being deported without their children at the hands of, I think they call it creating a hostile environment for immigration in the UK right now. So these same power structures that you just described in Caroline Norton's time haven't gone away in a sense, you know? And I think one of the aims from this protest read, and again, this is why I'm so happy to have you here, is that we want to raise awareness of issues that have been kind of systematically underreported by our political regime in the UK and the media that supports it. And one of these big things, like I said, is immigration detention centres. And another thing that I think you and I can talk about is violence against children in the UK.
You know, I was trying to understand the reasons why she was bringing that in. And what I thought was important was that, yes, she started talking about the immigration centers in America and how they were separating the children from mothers. And even then she was talking about that, I wasn't overly thinking very much about how our immigration services work in the UK and what those types of rigors are on mothers and children. And I think that there is a real dearth of conversation in the UK about the impact of the immigration centres on basic things, family life. And I think when you talk about the colonial structures, it's also about creating in the minds of people who consume news, because news is like a product, it's like Coke, yeah? And it's packaged for you in bite-sized pieces so that you can enjoy certain bits and not enjoy others. So when you consume the news about migration and asylum, because it's packaged for you as a constant, you know, it's the problem of migration, and it's about always suggesting that the whole relationship is that once we decolonized, we let go and it was all down to them and they're just basically crap at doing it, right? That's the reason they keep coming back, okay? That's the narrative that you get all the time. So I was thinking about that in relation to Norton's campaign. Now, the difference between her campaign, she was successful because she basically was a celebrity. Let's not get it twisted. She was having a relationship allegedly with the Home Secretary, which nearly brought down the government. So presumably it was on the version of Twitter in 1839. That's why she turned out to be. That's why she was able to do that. And the reason she was successful was because she had notoriety. Whereas the women at the detention centers, they have zero social capital, okay? So that's the reason why you don't have the same type of conversation. And then you get potential members of the government dreaming of sending people to Rwanda to advance their careers and having the strapline that they were the most effective Home Secretary in a policy that, you know, is devoid of any humanity. So the thing is, you can always in a structure which places hierarchy in particular places, you can cut your teeth on those at the bottom. So it doesn't matter, because you know what? No one's going to say anything. Let's not forget Shumaima Begum, okay? Yeah, when she was stripped of her nationality, a black person, a woman, someone who is working class, who has absolutely no social structures, or, you know, she's got no way of amplifying her voice. And it's always about using those groups to stand on so you can then elevate yourself. And invariably, it's the marginalized groups. Because if you think about the policymakers in the days of Norton and in the days of now, it's the same people.
It's the same families. Yeah.
It's the same people, the same families, and it's the same patriarchy. So you actually haven't had a change. You've just had a transition of power.
We come back to this kind of violence issue. And I talked about this again with Ilio last week. Like, you have this state-sanctioned violence that never is talked about in the context of being violence. You know, we see a lot of coverage of like gang culture or immigration issues, or the violence of war outside, or the violence of the US system, even sort of outside of us. But we don't have this public conversation about the violence committed on, in this case, we're talking about children. Like, I find it a bit difficult to sort of contextualize these ideas as like immigration issues, because it's an issue of children's rights, protecting children. And what we're talking about is direct intentional violence by the state against children. Well, and we all know what this means for them. And
look at what happened over here with the strip search of Child Q.
Child Q, I've got her on as well.
Yeah, so Child Q, for those people, because I'm presuming this is going out internationally, Child Q is a black child who was menstruating and was accused of having cannabis at school. She was then taken with the authority of the school and the head teacher. She was taken to a bathroom where she was strip searched, and she was menstruating, and they told her to remove her menstrual pads so they could examine her, open her anus, and she was basically dehumanized on school property by agents of the state. And as a consequence of that, there have been a number of investigations into the number of children who have been strip searched at school, and the majority of them are black. They are minors. They never appear, it never occurs in the presence of, like, for what they understand, like a Mackenzie friend or some sort of representative. So the violence of the state is not new. It's supported, it's compounded by indifference, and it is a lever upon which you can always argue that those communities need to be policed. They need particular policies, and it's in a deliberate act. So the question around violence and children and violence against women and state instruments and that are used for the implementation and the continued perpetration of that is not a subject that many commentators, A, would pick up, B, would even recognize, or C, would countenance, would be the subject of a phone-in. Except on the Headley Highlight Show, which you can catch on Twitter. Let me just plug that stuff. Headley Highlight Show. Catch it on Twitter every Friday, 8 p.m. GMT, people, because I don't play.
To go back again to sort of like the Caroline Norton protest, and what we could maybe, I don't want to say learn from it, because I think there's a lot of very specific context involved, as you just said, about the Caroline Norton case in itself and her celebrity and her access to power.
Yeah, she was friends with Leopold, apparently. They were quite good friends. King Leopold of Belgium was in her circle of influences, the butcher in Congo. So you need to also think about the context of her protest, because when you think about it, in a way, her protest was quite selfish. It was about her.
Absolutely. And
yeah,
as much as
she wasn't altruistic. She just lost her children, and then she was completely exercised about it, as you know most mothers would be. But it wasn't from a position of, I'm concerned about the world. It's like, I want my children back. You know, she was happy to benefit from all of the trappings of human trafficking, genocide, and theft. But there was no writings about that.
Exactly. What I'm thinking we might be able to sort of take from it is, so she wasn't able to frame her issue as a women's issue. She wasn't able to
No.
frame her issue as an issue of women's rights or mothers' rights to have access to their children. She had to flip it and make it an issue about children's rights and the protection of children, the protection of innocence. And I'm wondering, and this is why I want your perspective on this, like, do you think there's a space to try and to get sort of the policymakers on hand? Because we know exactly what policymakers we're talking about. We're talking about people who not only have benefited from white supremacy, but who are actively involved in pursuing white supremacist policies. We're talking about people who are actively involved in pursuing anti-women policies or anti-natalist policies, where they're trying to stop us from having access to
Roe v. Wade. Hello.
Exactly. And when we're talking about exactly the people who are pursuing these patriarchal white supremacist policies in real life today. And I'm wondering if there's space to reframe the issues like about child Q, about immigration detention centers, instead of trying to frame it as something about immigration, which apparently has a populist mandate to be just hammered upon for everything. Is there room to be framing this then as an issue of children's rights, the welfare of children? Or do you think that the propaganda machine dehumanizing certain groups in society has been too successful at also dehumanizing the children in these groups?
The next time you go on MSN, let me know how many black faces of black boys, young black men, you see put up as criminals. It's a daily exercise on MSN, you find. It's a daily exercise on many of these news feeds. But the point I'm making is that you are constantly fed a diet, whether you accept it or not. And this is one of the things that I talk about on my show with archetypes. You know, you see the headline about Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. You don't necessarily have to read the article, but you're constantly fed a headline. So effectively, you are being brainwashed. Yeah. So in answer to your question, is there a space for de-brainwashing or decolonizing? You have to first, A, accept that that's what's happening. And B, you also have to accept that you want to make a conscious decision not to be a passive recipient of those things. And therefore, I think the question about, is there a space? I think the space has already been carved out. And the reason the space has already been carved out is because you have a democratization of the media. That's what this is. That's why you and I are able to have this conversation, because what you're finding is, and this is what I really enjoy about the younger generation, and that lady who was interviewed on CNN when the guy was in Windsor is like, what does the Queen's passing mean to you? She's like, well, she was a nice lady, but they're a bit murky. I mean, look at her son and what he's done. And she goes, and let's not forget they've been colonizing all over the world, and you know, we don't really like them, that sort of thing. And the point was, the next generation, and I'm a bit more of a mature person, I'm older than you, but like, you know, essentially those groups, you know, your 40s, your 30s, your 20s, they're on a different level. So, you know, they're not going to be accepting of these narratives because, one, half of them don't watch TV, not mainstream TV. Half of them do not listen to mainstream radio. Okay. Is there a narrative? It's already existing. What the issue is that the old guard haven't caught up. So my opinion is there's no more need. You don't need to make any more space. You just have to leave certain communities, certain ideas, and essentially they go out of fashion. It doesn't mean we don't have to still have that conversation, but I am optimistic in a way, because I honestly believe, you know, I've got daughters, and my young adults keep me very much grounded in terms of my thinking, you know, and they point out certain ideas to me and they say to me, look, mom, no, mom, that's just, you know, that's so 1980. That's so 1970.
I love that for you, and I love that for your girls.
Yeah, it's so 1990, mum. I mean, come on, please, you know. So that's why I think the space has already been carved. Look what we're doing. Look what we're reading.
So basically, we're just waiting for the world to just sort of slowly walk their way to
the relevance of will only be important when he is giving clicks and likes. So one, and let me pull you up. You've mentioned him 4 times in here, okay? Yeah. I didn't mention that him once, right? And why?
Because I censor his name.
Yeah, because he's not important in the debate, in my opinion. Someone like is going to be in the same space as other political characters who serve a purpose for a purpose. Let's not forget where he's coming from. He's coming from a government that's been in effectively for almost 4 terms. They're very tired. They talk about the establishment, and they are the establishment. They talk about fixing things, and they're the archetypes or the architecture with which we're moving in a certain direction. So I don't think that type of politics and those type of politicians will have much relevance by the time your daughter is at secondary school. And the reason is because the cycle of knowledge and information just moves on, and people change their opinions. And where we are at the moment is you've got a real antagonism towards change. But the problem is people are making alternative structures. And those alternative structures eventually, like any society, will go like this. So I'm hopeful.
You're so right. You're absolutely so right. And I'm going to censor his name when I do that edit. You are just...
Take him out, girl.
Bringing all the troops home. Like, I got to have a sticky note on my computer. Stop mentioning this list of names.
Because what we do is we amplify these people.
Exactly.
And I think also if we give them succor, they then have the right to respond.
And they have a platform in the new media.
Exactly. Why are we giving look, the mere fact that you and I are talking on this type of platform means that we have a bit more democracy than we had when I was your age.
Yeah.
You understand? So to me, more power to us, yeah? The revolution will be on Zoom.
Oh. I can't even right now.
I thought it was quite a beautiful line. They talked about when a child reaches 20 weeks, if it's a girl, I know, isn't that gorgeous? Oh my God, it touched me so deep. I'm not going to cry, yeah? Let me just keep the eye, yeah? It did, it got me too. When she said, when a child reaches 20 weeks, she is potentially a mother and a grandmother, even though she isn't born. Think about the power. Think about the power of women. And if you think about how women invariably are, even with all her privilege, women invariably are the grassroots a lot of the time to keeping resistance alive. And often, because the women are the nurturers, I know it is a bit emotional, isn't it? The women are the nurturers. Yeah. So we effectively carry on the lineage of resistance. And that is why women are so important in the movement. So I don't have, I'm looking for more opportunities to speak, to create more followers, to have greater debates, because I believe as a woman, I am a grassroots soldier, and I have been from day